Thank you very much for the invitation to come to talk to you. And second, an apology. It was apparent from a brief conversation with Boris at coffee this morning that he was expecting a completely different talk. So I put in various stop points in this one. So when you get fed up with it, let me know. There are various break points that I can get out of it. So really this is about how toddlers extract meaning from words and how they put a lexical semantic system in place. Let's start out with experiment in language-mediated attention. Okay, I should have prepared an audio stimulus here, just for the non-native English speakers, which I guess is everybody here. These are trousers. Okay, so what do you look at when you hear trousers? Just give you a few moments to think about that. All right, okay, well we did the whole experiment with you and measured your eye movements accurately. About 300 to 400 milliseconds after word onset, you would look at the train. And about 300 or 400 milliseconds after that, you'll start looking at the hat. Okay? So this is relatively well-known experiment in the field. The idea here is to demonstrate that there is an activation of a cascade of different types of mental representations upon hearing a word. And questions that you might ask is, where is the locus of the match between hearing a word and then identifying what picture you're going to look at? The standard story is what's often referred to as the visual hypothesis, the reasonable supposition that when you hear a word, you do some auditory processing on the word, and that activates some kind of phonological representation, which then enables you to activate some perceptual representation and then match to a picture on the screen at the visual level. That's the usual way that people working in this visual world paradigm domain usually argue. Huttig and McQueen argued that there's an alternative, not necessarily mutually exclusive alternative, that they call the phonological hypothesis. That is, during the preview period of looking at those images, you may be tagging each of those pictures with a label, something that maybe has some phonological detail in it. And during that process of tagging, you can then use the phonological tag, the name of the object, if you will, to decide which picture to look at. So the match is at the phonological level. And they argue in an experiment that if you remove the preview period, you had some seconds to view those pictures, you will note. In fact, you seem to get rid of the phonological effect. That is to say, you don't look at the train first, you look at the hat. So that would seem to suggest that that's interfering with the ability to implicitly name, if you will, those objects, and therefore obtain the phonological match. One might then ask, when do infants and toddlers start to engage or make use of a system of representation that is similar to adults? That is to say, when do we see this cascade of representations from phonological to semantic unfolding whilst viewing scenes similar to the ones I showed you before? The advent of automatic eye tracking has helped us address this problem in more detail with infants as we've got better at doing eye tracking with our young subjects. So we're going to do exactly what Huttig and McQueen did with our adults and see whether infants will engage in the same kind of unfolding of the kind of representations that Huttig and McQueen and others argued takes place when you hear a word. So we're going to see a picture of 4 pictures where there will be a phonological distractor, a taxonomic distractor, in this case, and 2 unrelated distractors. And we're just going to look at the probability of fixating those pictures as time unfolds and see whether they change over time. And what we find is pretty clear-cut. Okay, right. So we've got 24-month-olds and 30-month-olds here. The blue line plots the probability of fixating the phonological distractor at both ages, and the dashed green line plots the probability of fixating the taxonomic distractor. I should have said that the taxonomic distractor has no associative relationship with the target word. And so what you can see here is just like the adults, at 24 months, though to a greater extent at 30 months, we see an initial fixation of the phonological distractor followed by fixating the taxonomic distractor, suggesting that probably by about 24 months of age, maybe before, infants are already showing this cascaded-like processing from the word to phonology to some kind of semantics. In this case, taxonomic semantics. We can play around with it and do similar kinds of experiments with thematic or associative distractors. In this case, the target, the absent target, is butterfly. You hear butterfly. And what infants do is, first of all, fixate the brush, and then they fixate the the thematically related foil, in this case the flower, where presumably butterflies accumulate. So we've got good reason to suppose here that various types of semantic relationships are being activated upon hearing a word after you've accessed some kind of phonological relationship. Unlike adults, however, and this is work to be resolved, if we take away the preview time, that is to say, with the infants, we gave them about 4 seconds to look at those pictures before a name was heard. If we just give them 200 milliseconds, which is what Huttig and McQueen did in their study, and removed any phonological effect, we still see some sense of a phonological fixation. That is to say, it doesn't seem to be the case that you need all of this preview time in order to use what they called the phonological hypothesis or the phonological route. You're essentially hearing words through time and you're looking at pictures. Why not use all the information you've got in order to direct your fixations appropriately? One thing I misled you about, however, was the items that Huttig and McQueen used in their study some 10 years ago were line drawings like this. So we've always been using photographs of objects. Maybe it takes more time to extract the names from these more impoverished visual stimuli, and therefore you don't get the phonological effect. Shimon might have some views about that. Okay, so what's going on here is activating of different types of representations over time. And one of the possibilities that seems to present itself is that when infants look at pictures, the previous speaker suggested that they're tagged. Well, let's suggest that they're in fact named implicitly. So here is a study with 18-month-old infants where we give them what's called a phonological priming task. Actually, it's probably better called a picture priming task, in which, first of all, they're exposed to a picture for about 1.5 seconds in silence, and then a blank screen for about half a second, and then a picture pair with an auditory stimulus directing them to gaze at one of the pictures. So they just hear ball in this case. So what we want to know, of course, as I hope is apparent from the setup here, is does the label that wasn't uttered, note, affect the infant's preference for these objects that are one of these objects that are going to be named? In other words, do they implicitly label those objects? And the answer is yes. In fact, it's quite a strong effect. At 18 months, if they saw the car and had to identify the ball, the proportion of looking at the target picture, the ball, is pretty dismal. In fact, it doesn't differ from chance. Whereas if we have a related prime, that is to say a bus begins with B at 18 months, they show strong effects. So there's a clear effect here that demonstrates that when infants are processing the world, looking at pictures and presumably objects, there is a chance that they may actually name these objects. And that naming, who knows, might even help them promote category formation and things like that when they hear that different objects are called the same name. Various other online measures can also show that this effect is taking place. This was at 18 months of age, where vocabularies, depending on whether you're measuring expressive or receptive vocabularies, are still quite small prior to the so-called vocabulary spurt, but they're going to have some hundreds of words in their receptive vocabularies by this time. What happens at 24 months of age if we do the same experiment? Okay, so exactly the same experiment, but now we have a reversal of the effect. At 24 months of age, they're better in the unrelated condition than in the primed condition. It's a bit odd. Now, it turns out that in English, there is a preponderance of B words in infant vocabularies. Pretty well from about 15 months of age. Lots of words beginning with B. In the psycholinguistic literature, you may be familiar with something called the cohort effect. That is to say, if you're processing words as adults, then the number of words that begin with the same sound has an effect on your speed of recognition of those words, such that the larger the number of words, the slower your recognition. Because these things presumably are competing with each other, you're activating a large cohort, you've got to do some work to inhibit the irrelevant ones in the cohort. And that's what's going on here. Babies, the B in the bus, in the original pictures that I showed you, that happens to be a large cohort. And by the time you get to 24 months of age, these cohort sizes are pretty big. And you can see that if we separate whether the words that are being used or the pictures that are being used are large or small cohort words, we can turn around whether it's a facilitating process or inhibitory process. That is to say, we're beginning to see at 24 months of age exactly the same kind of inhibitory processes that we see in adults. At 18 months, we're not seeing that. Now, in a whole other area of work on phonological word recognition, we've demonstrated using an adaptation of the trace model of speech recognition that in order to capture a fairly wide variety of infant mispronunciation studies, you have to manipulate the inhibition parameter in trace in order to get it to work. That is to say, at 18 months, you have to turn off inhibition, lexical inhibition in trace, whereas you turn it back on, or at least you turn it up to get to simulate the results at 24 months of age. So what we see here, I think, is some evidence of where we want to go in the rest of this talk, and that is to say the development of inhibitory processes in the lexical semantic system as a way of helping the infant focus attention on which word is relevant at this particular point in time when it's going to build a lexical semantic system. Okay. So we might ask, when we're acquiring a vocabulary as infants, do we just learn listings of words and associated concepts, or are we more adult-like in the sense of trying to add words into a semantic network of some kind? In the adult literature, what you do is to engage in priming studies, such as lexical decision. So we know that doctor seems to be related to nurse, because if you have to perform lexical decision on nurse, you're faster if you've just heard doctor than if you'd heard an unrelated word. So we use priming studies to investigate the structure of the lexicon in adults. We can't ask infants to do lexical decision. So we have to come up with an adaptation of, or some analog of lexical decision in order to see whether they're building semantic networks or not. I'm going to hop over that to save time. Better to tell you about the experiment. So this is a study where we're going to use a preferential looking task, which really is just a simplified version of the visual world paradigm, to act as our lexical decision, if you will. Prior to seeing two pictures, the infant hears a pair of words. And those pairs of words, in this case, are cat and dog. So that is to say, they're a pair of words that are associatively and taxonomically related to each other. Other kinds of conditions might be plate dog, unrelated, or they just hear the prime cat followed by the neutral place filler look, or completely unrelated, plate look. What we would expect if there is an appreciation or sensitivity to the relationships between the words, the word pairs that they're hearing just before they see these picture pairs, is that you might see a difference in the amount of target looking depending on whether the word pairs are related or not. Yep. So those are the four conditions that infants hear word pairs in. related pairs, unrelated neutral pairs, just the prime by itself, and completely unrelated auditory information. You have to play around for years, literally years, to get the parameters of these experiments just right so infants do them. Getting the ISI and the SOA just right so that it works. But hey, we're all used to that kind of annoying stuff. But quite a lot of work went into getting this to work. We've now got it working, and this is what happens. Bottom line is that 18-month-olds don't show priming, and 21-month-olds show inhibitory priming. What do I mean by that? So let's look at the 18-month-olds to begin with. The two bars that are clearly above chance, where we have a proportional measure here, we can use others, are the 18-month-olds' tendency to look at the target picture, the one that was named, and they will look at the one that is named irrespective of what word occurred before it. Yeah? Our 21-month-olds perform worse. They only perform well in the condition where there is a related prime before the target word. If there is an unrelated prime, they're at chance together with the other conditions. This difference, of course, is significantly different, indicating a priming effect. Why are the 18-month-olds performing better? Well, if they've got a semantic system in place, then clearly this acts as a double-edged sword. If the 21-month-olds have got a semantic system in place, this acts as a double-edged sword, in the sense that not only can you inhibit, but you can also facilitate. The 18-month-olds seem to be behaving as though these label meaning representations are just listed in isolation from each other. Related and unrelated ones are just as good. Related and unrelated words are just as good. But if you start putting these together in a relational network of some kind, a lexical semantic network, if you're unrelated, you're going to inhibit the processing of what you're going to hear next. So what we've shown here is that by 21 months of age, infants seem to have a lexical semantic network in place for which we have little evidence at 18 months, at least not for the next 5 to 10 minutes. We can titrate this a bit by looking at the nature of those semantic relationships. So instead of having word pairs that are both associatively and taxonomically related, we can just use taxonomically related pairs like trousers, hat, as you saw before. Or only associatively or thematically related like dog, bone. If you take away what in the adult psycholinguistic literature is called the semantic boost of the doctor-nurse type, then you find that priming effects are delayed. You don't see them until about 24 months of age. Same type of priming effects, that is to say, an unrelated prime will inhibit processing of the target word. But we have evidence here, at least, that during the second half of the second year of life, infants are putting this network in place, and inhibitory processes seem to be coming online. Okay, well, that's a bit of an ad hoc, post hoc explanation. So I'm going to now describe a set of experiments for you. Sorry, this is really a change in the way that we've been talking. There's one experiment after the other, but so be it. I'm going to try and convince you that 24-month-olds, but not 18-month-olds, are able to do semantic inhibition independently of the post hoc explanation I gave for the priming experiments. This is where you do it in adults. So, again, using lexical decision, what you do is to provide a prime like dog. You then have an intervening stimulus like C. Let's forget about the control condition for the moment, where you also have to make a decision. And then you have the target cat. Forget about the left-right stuff. We don't want to get into that here. If the intervening stimulus is unrelated to the prime, then any decision about the related target, cat, is slowed down compared to if the intervening stimulus, if these two are unrelated. Suggesting, the authors argue, that having to make a decision about C engages backward semantic priming of the first item, in this case, dog. So that backward priming, or inhibitory tagging, as they describe it, then interferes with the lexical decision and slows it down for related target items, in this case, cat. Okay, and this is evidence for backward semantic priming. So how are we going to do this with infant? We're going to do the same kind of thing, but of course we're going to use pictures, and we're going to label pictures. Again, I'm not going to spend any time describing control conditions, but the basic idea is, again, you probably can't see this. This is a chair, and we're going to label it chair. We're then going to have an intervening stimulus, which is unrelated to the target, to the prime picture. And then, in absence of any labeling, as just an encouragement to look at these two pictures, we allow free looking of two objects, in this case one that is related to the initial prime and one which is unrelated. Now, if you think positive facilitary priming is going on most of the time, then you would expect chair to activate target more and encourage the infant to look at the table. But if you believe in this backward semantic priming stuff, and that infants are doing this, then moving the infant out of that semantic space from furniture to animals is going to inhibitorily tag the chair, so that when a preference has to be expressed for either the table or the flower, then the infant is not going to show a preference for the table, but indeed the flower. Is the logic clear? And that's exactly what happens. So what you see here is the amount of looking in the unrelated prime condition compared to the related prime condition. These are just the controls where you can see that the whole thing switches round. That is to say, at 24 months, infants show inhibitory priming, backwards inhibitory, semantic inhibitory priming in the unrelated condition. It's exactly what we want. So by 24 months of age, infants are engaged in this kind of backward inhibitory stuff. So obviously the next thing to do is ask, well, what do 18-month-olds do? To cut a long story short, you can see that the 18-month-olds are now showing positive priming. It switches from being inhibitory at 24 months to being purely facilitating at 18 months. So independent evidence that during the course of the construction of this lexical semantic system, these inhibitory processes are coming online. Right, this is the first stop point, or I can go to the next stage. Okay, right. Yeah, moving on. Okay. Now I'm going to partially undermine much of what I've just told you. So, nearly all of these studies with toddlers use labels in the presence of pictures. And as you've seen, hopefully it's obvious why we're doing that, because we need the pictures to decide whether they've understood something or not. But can we show, or can we demonstrate appreciation of the meanings of words and their relationships in the absence of such pictures with infants? And there's a task called the head-turn preference procedure, which has been used for several decades now, which is usually used to look at infant sensitivity to different kinds of characteristics of the speech signal. What you essentially do is infant's got to turn her head towards a flashing light, and when she turns her head towards the flashing light, as long as she keeps her head turned, a sequence of words is played. And you hope that systematic differences in the sequence of words or whatever auditory stimuli you're interested in, systematic differences engage the infant's interest differentially, and indeed it does. So you can look at motherese kind of experiments, you can look at stress patterns and show that this works. But what people haven't done until very recently is simply to use this to see whether infants can understand the words. And what we've done here is to simply present infants with lists of words that either belong to the same category or from mixed categories. So dog, pig, cat, sheep, horse, etc. Another categories, food, or you can have mixed stuff like sock, nappy, ear, boots, all mixed up. And we measure the amount of time that infants spend listening to these lists and see whether related categories engage the infant for longer than unrelated categories. And the answer is, of course, yes. Notice this is at 18 months. Right? Now, if you think about it for a moment, if we've done the experiment properly, who knows, but let's hope we have, the only way that there could be a difference here is if, one, they've computed the meaning of the word, because we'll go with Saussure and say that there's an arbitrary relationship between sound and meaning. And two, that they have computed the relationship between the meanings of those words. Because otherwise, you shouldn't see a difference. So in other words, what this tells us, that by 18 months of age, you've got some kind of appreciation of the relationships of the meanings of words in place. This seems to be a facilitatory effect. We're not getting inhibition here. Notice, if it was inhibition, we would expect to see a different pattern of results. So that's the basic finding. I'm now going to try and just titrate that a bit and then finish up. So these are taxonomically related words. That is to say, they're not associated with each other, and that they're not like dog, cat. They are like trousers, hat, if you will. What if we start playing around with the type of relationships in these word lists? We're going to do an experiment now where we want to find out how long-lasting these priming effects are. That's the first experiment. We're going to, instead of having a 400 millisecond ISI between the words, we're going to increase it to 800 milliseconds. We're now, as you're going to see, when we increase it to 800 milliseconds, the taxonomic effect is going to go away. We don't get priming, suggesting that taxonomic priming is short-lived in these infants. What happens if we now put the semantic or the priming boost in there and add in some kind of associative strength? What happens there? And then we're going to look at younger ages. So this is the first replication of the first study. So related lists attract longer looking than the mixed condition list when you've got taxonomic links between the words at 400 milliseconds. Expand that to 800 milliseconds and the effect disappears. We no longer have any preference for either list, suggesting no priming is going on whatsoever. And now what we do is to put in an associative boost at the same timing interval, and we get the effect back again, suggesting that this associative effect, perhaps in combination with the taxonomic effect, is really doing a lot of work in when the infants are trying to figure out the relationship between word meanings, at least in this task. So then one might ask, what happens if we go younger? Now, you can ask the general question here. When infants are building this semantic system, are they doing it from the very beginning? Are words being plugged into some kind of semantic network from the very first attempts to acquire words? Or are they in isolation? Is there a point at which they start to begin to build this semantic system? So we're going to try and push it down and see how potent these kind of semantic relations are. And this is our first attempt at doing this. So what we're going to do now is, because our very young 15-month-olds don't know as many words as our 18-month-olds, who know even less than our 21-month-olds, we're going to adapt the paradigm a little bit and just use word pairs. This is actually adapting a design that Willits et al. Did with 2.5-year-olds. We've taken a leaf out of their book, and now we're using this with 15-month-olds. So again, what they're going to do is they're going to get related or unrelated lists, so cat, pig, they're just listening to this list of words, or unrelated lists, shoe, dog, etc. Purely taxonomic links between the related lists. And then in a fourth experiment, because this one ain't going to work, we're going to throw in the taxonomic boost, the associative boost as we did before, to see whether that now gets the infant to listen longer, thereby demonstrating that there's a priming effect in place. So this is what happens with the taxonomic pairs. There's no effect at 15 months, but we have a very strong effect when we put the associative boost in on top of that taxonomic listing, suggesting that even as early as 15 months of age now, the associative relationships between words seem to be playing a major role in the acquisition of a semantic system, insofar as it's indexed by this priming effect that we get in these types of experiments. So we've got sensitivity for word-to-word semantic links at 15 months. Associative links seem to be stronger than our taxonomic links. They're more robust. And it possibly is the case that they are developmentally prior to taxonomic links. So we're using associative event information in the world to build that lexical semantic system. And I think I should stop there, because I'm sure you're all dying to go. Thank you very much.